Morning all. Let's have a look at the classic encounter between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov in the World Championship match of 1984, which, as many of you know, was unfortunately aborted to the horror and disgust of Kasparov at the time. Campomones was FIDE president, I believe, and it caused a lot of controversy, this match, the aborted match 1984. At the start of the match, it seemed Anatoli was playing exceptionally strongly, and this game from game 3 is very, very interesting to check out, not least because Anatoli kicked off with e4, which is not a usual first move against Kasparov. Usually he stays with d4. Okay, so e4, and Kasparov played the Sicilian defense, c5. After knight f3, e6, an open Sicilian d4. After c takes, knight takes. Knight c6 is played, which sometimes invites a Sveshnikov variation by transposition. After knight b5, d6 though, the move bishop f4, for example, could lead or transpose into a Sicilian Sveshnikov, but instead we have the dreaded Maroczy bind, named after the player Maroczy. So the Maroczy bind is trying to clamp down on black's counterplay, especially the d5 square, to stop black liberating with d5. In this game, Kasparov accepted that bind for the moment. He played knight f6, the pawn was protected, and now he played a6. After knight a3, we have a position which fits in to the style of Karpov's play. When Karpov was defaulted as world champion in 1973, when Fischer did not want to play Karpov, could not agree conditions with FIDE, Karpov had a long reign, and it's so he wanted to really prove that he was the strongest in the world and not just a token title of world champion. And his style was marked out as the kind of python, squeezing the counterplay, the life out of the opponent's positions, and then striking later on, or just the microscopic advantages, being able to accumulate them and win on those as well. So here there's a bind. It's a positional advantage. He's not necessarily going for a kingside attack. So let's see, he's just content with binding and stopping Kasparov from playing an active plan. So bishop e3, bishop b7, and we see queen b3, which looks annoying for b6. Okay, here Kasparov actually plays a more aggressive response, that what you might think knight d7 would be perhaps too passive here. Instead, the more aggressive response, knight a5 here, pardon me, targets e4. So is it going to be an exchange of prisoners scenario? But will the queens come off here? Queen takes b6. So white is showing interest in just playing the position here. He will have, after the smoke clears here, a pawn majority on the queen side. So taking, we see potential pawn majority on the cards in the resulting situation here. So Anatoly, he takes on d8 here. We see bishop takes d8. A rook takes d8. Well, there's bishop b6. b6 has to be covered, it seems. So bishop takes d8. So what advantages does white have in this position? Well, embarrassingly maybe for black, you're concerned if you were playing black to have this d pawn here on the semi-open file. It is targeted with the simple move rook ad1 here. And you might think, well, couldn't you just protect it? Kasparov chose not to protect it, and we'll check in the second pass of this game various ways of defending d6 here. It does seem a little bit vulnerable. There might be, for example, we'll check out knight b7 as well as bishop moves if we really want to protect this pawn. But Kasparov played d5 here. And now, of course, there is a forcing move which stops the bishop being useful for d5. f3 is played, and after bishop f5, it seems as though Anatoly is winning a centre pawn but that's not the end of the story. C takes, E takes, and Anatoly plays rook takes d5. And here we see the idea of Kasparov is actually relying on this skewer for rook and the pawn on a2 to regain his pawn, but it's Anatoly's move. So in this position, rook d6 highlights the poor a6 pawn. White is still going to be a pawn up here. Will black have sufficient resources to be able to draw though? So bishop takes a2, an exchange of prisoners, as Nimzowitsch would say. Rook takes a6. Refusing exchange of rooks with rook b8 here. And now we see that this knight is actually quite useful on a3. There's an often used expression, a knight on the rim is dim, but we're about to see the harassment of this rook on f8, making use, believe it or not, of this knight on a3. So the first forcing move, limiting black's options and slightly improving the position for white at the same time, is bishop c5. Not only does it threaten the rook, it removes tactical liability on the e-file for those two bishops, just in case they were vulnerable. And the bishop on c5 will be supporting later b4. This is a running past pawn potentially. Okay. And of course we should investigate other things like rook b2, but I think just bishop takes f8 there. In this position, rook e8 was deemed necessary. And we see now the use of the knight on a3 for bishop b5, gaining with tempo. Bishop getting away from that e-file, and now of course b4 is potentially on the cards. So attacking this rook again. Rook e6 is played. Okay. And Anatoly, he doesn't take on e6, he instead plays b4, another forcing move. Black is being pushed back here, and the knight's still showing it's useful for controlling c4 as well. I mean, no knight c4 in this position. Instead, the knight decides to go back to b7. We will check out in the second pass. I think rook takes a6 is necessary to check out there. Okay, but knight b7, as though there's a nice option potentially of knight c5. The bishop gets out of the way of knight c5. So what has Anatoly emerged with here? Although the knight is on a3, it's still useful. This pawn is still dangerous. The queens coming off have really simplified the game since then, and white's bishops look very nicely placed, and pieces generally, for this b pawn. We see bishop e7 targeting the b pawn, and it's simply being protected now with knight c2. And now, okay, it is a bit of a tricky position for black. How on earth does he defend this? If he tries attacking this knight again, for example, there's knight d4, that's a pointless threat it would seem. So he puts the bishop on d5 here, and we see another forcing move from Anatoly, rook d1. It seems post Maroczy bind being removed that white has been able to use multiple threats to improve the position and try and consolidate this one extra pawn that he has here. But you might think, well, hang on, is there a weakness of the last move here? This potential skewer. Well, that's pounced on with bishop b3, so there's no knight d4 here. But we see a very clever response in this position. Can you guess what Anatoly plays here? Because it looks as though this is a bit of a problem, because b4 is also attacked. What on earth did Anatoly have in mind? If I give you 10 seconds here, can you spot what he played here? So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, Anatoly played rook d7, and I believe one idea is to make use of the potentially weak back row. So for example, bishop c2, rook takes b7, and then if rook takes check, and here bishop c5 might be embarrassing, but we'll check these variations out in the second pass in more detail with the help of our engine friends. But rook d7, from Kasparov's point of view, he didn't want to take on c2, so he played actually rook d8, and this is quite a tricky move because it seems if rook takes b7 there might be the option of rook d1 or bishop c2 is going to be okay there. There's no back row issue. Okay, in this position another seemingly ingenious move is played here. Can you guess what Anatoly plays in this position? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, rook takes e6, not sacrificing anything, but it seems that white is generating more threats than black at the moment. This c2 knight doesn't have to be moved evidently. Okay, so Kasparov tried rook takes d7, and here we see another seemingly very clever move, protecting the first row with rook e1, and of course that bishop is attacking the rook here, so black cannot win that knight just yet. He plays rook c7. A lot of forcing moves in this game, and it continues again. Can you see what Anatoly plays now? So the clue is it's another forcing move and potentially improves white's position and safeguards actually as a side effect this b4 pawn, which is white's visual trump card here. Okay, white attacked again with bishop b6, so he wants to get the rook away from the bishop, and he does so. So with this exchange here, it seems unfortunately the b pawn's no longer attacked, b7's attacked, back row seems vulnerable. Knight d6 protects e8 for a moment and attacks the bishop, but now just bishop c5 is played, and here Garry Kasparov thinks enough is enough. It looks as though his back row has been destroyed, his back row safety. If the knight moves then rook e8, it looks devastating. Here he resigned. So Anatoly was now 1-0 up in this classic 1984 encounter match. First World Championship match between them. Let's check with engine help through this game, which was full of forcing moves after the Maroczy binds basically. Here it seems hopeless. Of course the back row is really an issue. There's no saving resource for black, it seems. Here what does black do? Bishop c4, bishop takes d6, just protecting e2. There's nothing really black can do. So let's go back in the game and see this opening. So the Maroczy bind, trying to restrain black's counterplay, was played, a choice which fits in with Anatoly's style. Counterplay removal. It seems knight d7 is actually the preferred method of defending b6 here rather than counter-attacking. And as though black is doing okay, in fact. So say it's queen c2, knight c5, rook a d1, rook b8. Is this Maroczy bind that dangerous? The point is, it's going to be a position with black having to drum up some counterplay somewhere, and okay, but it's probably pliable. This weakness is not sometimes that exploitable. It's a visual weakness, and sometimes it's not that exploitable. This kind of scenario, okay, is probably about equal chances, well, according to engine evaluation there anyway. So we'll go back. So this was quite committal, this path with knight a5. An aggressive response. rather than a kind of passive, more passive looking response, but committing to queen takes b6, this forcing set of transactions where the queens are coming off, and d6 now a target. But again, why couldn't d6 have been defended more adequately rather than d5, which set off another chain of forcing moves? d5, if you think about it, also weakens this diagonal for targeting this rook. So here, let's say bishop e7. Is white significantly better? Knight b1, rook a b8. Let's try rerouting the knight. Knight c3, rook d2. Could we say this is a winning advantage with the knight rerouted like that, and black's b file not really meaning that much? It's a persistent advantage. If white tries to gain space like this, it looks comfortable. It looks very comfortable for white. Knight a4, bishop d4. We can say that. Maybe this is the sort of position Kasparov wants to avoid. So we get, actually, after this rook a d1, another committal response d5, inviting some forcing moves from white, quite a few actually, starting with f3, and now c takes d, and now rook takes d5 is liked by the engine above all else, just to take that pawn, invite the skewer, to play rook d6 to counter attack on a6, and after this, white is a pawn up. Although only half a pawn, according to engine evaluation here, as though black has a little bit of counterplay, and maybe should have tried rook a6 in fact on this brief depth. Let's have a look at rook a6. Bishop takes, bishop e7. Is this a better try? Well, it depends how exploitable this passed pawn is, this b pawn. It looks as though possibly black can try and blockade. The engine treats it as less than half a pawn technically in this position at depth 18. It looks as though there's chances to hold up this pawn. So let's go back. In the game actually, rook a b8. And now we see more forcing moves. Bishop c5, bishop b5, and it looks as though white has a significant advantage in this position now. With knight b7 now, tried as the rook a6. If rook a6, let's go with knight b3 here. This looks as though it's still okay for white. So okay, so knight b7, bishop goes back, knight c2. White's advantage seems to be growing by each move now, 1.5 units advantage. Things have gone wrong. Now rook d7 looks like a clever, idea going into this self skewer. Who would have thought in this position to go into a self skewer? But this is exactly what Karpov did, inviting this bishop b3. So rook d7. Let's have a look at this position. If bishop takes c2, and I think I've got my analysis wrong, my intuitive analysis wrong, the idea wasn't rook b7, it was rook e6, with the idea of rook takes e7. The knight's not got too many useful squares. And something like bishop f1, the rook can't take the rook e8 check, so that looks nasty. On my continuation, intuitively, the idea is rook takes b7 probably is not that good. I assume rook takes b7. It's pardon me. After rook d7 here, if bishop takes c2, if rook takes b7 here, this probably doesn't work. This doesn't work. Rook be7, pardon me, from the first pass. I just assumed it was a back row issue, but no, more straightforward than that. So this is why it's important to check with engines to really get to the truth of positions. So after Rook d7, the simple idea is actually e7 to take on e6 and then take on e7 if bishop takes c2. And you might think, well, hang on a sec, what, has black got the option of Rook a6? Let's check that out. Bishop takes a6, bishop takes c2, Rook takes e7 again. White's doing great. This pawn, is it actually a problem? Rook d7 here. It's not really a problem. It's very bad for black. So let's go back. So Rook d7, black's in serious deep water here. Garry tried Rook d8. We get the same idea. Rook takes e6. Rook takes d7 is tried, which it seems hopeless anyway, the position. If f takes, then taking here, if we take here, bishop g3 looks pretty nasty actually because of things like bishop e5 now. On g7, that rook on the 7th looks beautiful, targeting g7 in this position. And if knight d6, bishop d7 targeting e6, black's collapsing. So let's go back after this Rook d7. Okay, so it seems as though it's downhill for black. Rook e1, keeping the threat now on d7. So the rook moves. Now again, a very powerful forcing move, bishop b6. Basically to try and win this e7, so the b pawn is less endangered. It seems utterly hopeless now, with the back row now being a problem. So this was it here, I believe. After bishop c5, Garry resigned. An epic first encounter, and actually, statistically, one of the very, very few times that Anatoly Karpov has defeated Garry Kasparov with 1e4. I think there was an encounter, just a simul or something, and a not very serious game before that. But other than that, this is the first very serious game which e4 was used to defeat Kasparov by Anatoly Karpov. Hope you got something out of it. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.